Thy will be done, teaching the Talmidi Israelite faith through the words of the Our Father, by Shmuel ben Naftali. Visit our website at www.talmidi.co.il. Part 1. Lessons learned along the way. Chapter 1. My own personal journey. Section 3. My personal history. Continued from the last video. In August 1977, I spent 3 weeks with my mother on the island of Sri Lanka, the country of my birth. I travelled round with her to various Catholic churches and shrines, and in this overwhelmingly Buddhist country I felt that the God I had been taught to believe in and worship was completely absent. However, there was another presence that I felt very strongly, the presence of the God that I experienced aside from the one I was taught, and that God was there with me, along every step of my journey around the island. During the years that followed, this God, our Heavenly Father, was with me wherever I travelled on the planet. This God did not change, was constant and unfailing. In my late teens, I became interested in our family history. I was very close to my grandmother, whom I loved very dearly. She practiced some odd customs that are unusual even for the small Eurasian community I was born into in Sri Lanka, the Burgher people. For example, when I was 30 days old, she insisted on giving her local Catholic priest 5 silver coins in payment for me as the firstborn. Needless to say, the priest thought she was bonkers. Also, she used to crack individual eggs into a saucer to ensure that there was no blood in any of them. She would soak meat in salt water to remove all traces of blood, and she would put a fresh tablecloth on the table every Friday night. Years later, I was describing these and other customs to a Unitarian minister, and he said to me, "Were your ancestors conversos?" Now, at the time, I had no idea who or what conversos were. I did some research in my local library and learned more about them. I even travelled to the Museum of the Diaspora in Tel Aviv, where I found out more about these secret Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity upon pain of death, but who secretly maintained the customs of their Jewish heritage. I learned that during a brief window in the early 17th century, Jewish people were allowed to leave Portugal, and these refugees dispersed around the world. Some went to Goa in India, and when the Inquisition came to Goa, some fled from there to Ceylon. There most of them abandoned their Jewish heritage completely and threw themselves unreservedly into the task of assimilating with the Catholic faith. On that same trip to Israel in the mid-1990s, I made my first visit to the Western Wall. This ancient structure is part of a massive retaining wall. It formed the 4 sides of the foundation platform upon which the Second Temple was built. The western section of it is the most complete, and for centuries it was the only section accessible to Jewish pilgrims. It is also the nearest location to the original site of the last temple. On that first visit, I was full of expectation. I had heard that the experience brought many people to tears, so great was the spiritual intensity of the encounter with the divine. As I touched the ancient stones, I felt the world fade out. I had the sense that all my earthly concerns and troubles were growing more and more distant. I had the uncanny sensation that I had touched a doorway in the universe, and I felt completely enveloped in love. My soul received an enthusiastic infusion of joyous greeting. At that point, I knew that this was the God I had always known, the God who had always been with me. And I wept with perfect happiness. It was the single, purest, most cleansing encounter I have ever had with God. From that moment on, there was to be purpose to my lifelong journey of faith. But I am jumping too far ahead. Returning to the 1980s, I recall a program on British television called Jesus the Evidence. The makers of this short series said that their researchers had spent years looking into the history of the time, the politics, the languages, the traditions and customs of ancient Judaism and the pagan Mediterranean, and had come to the conclusion that Yeshua's first Jewish followers could not possibly have believed him to have been one person of a Trinity, let alone a God. Now, as a committed Christian, you can imagine that this greatly incensed me. So I took the momentous decision to embark upon this very same journey myself. I would undertake to research the history of ancient Judaism and the pagan Mediterranean world myself, as well as the customs, traditions, languages, politics and beliefs of that time. I determined that I would come up with a very different conclusion, that traditional mainstream Christianity was right, and that the program makers were incontrovertibly wrong. I spent all my spare money on books, even to the extent of foregoing food or clothing if I felt that a particular book could provide me with a precious and vital insight. I bought commentaries on every book of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I bought books on all the varieties of Jewish belief that existed at that time. I bought history books and language books to study, and I taught myself Aramaic and Hebrew. I also bought books on such simple things as the food, clothing, and domestic life of ordinary Jewish and Gentile people of that time, simply to enable my inquiring mind to grasp the cultural nuances of the ancient Jewish faith. In short, I wanted to know first century life in the Holy Land in the same depth and detail as a Jewish person of that time would have known it. I spent 7 long years doing this research. I even spent nearly every day for a year in the prestigious British Library and in the Dr. Williams Library in London, both treasure troves of information. In all honesty, without disrespect or judgment of what modern Christianity stands for, I can only say that I slowly came to the same conclusion that the researchers of the program had, that Yeshua's first Jewish followers could not possibly have believed him to have been a god. Furthermore, what this exercise unexpectedly managed to achieve was to give me an enduring appreciation of biblical non-rabbinic Judaism. It also brought to my attention the ancient community of the Jewish followers of Yeshua, led for many years by James the Just, also known as Jacob the Pious, or in Hebrew, Yaakov HaTzadik. I became fascinated by the history of this illustrious Jewish community, whose very existence is, seemingly, deliberately concealed by the mainstream religious establishment. As I found out more and more about them, I came to realize that I identified very, very much with their spirituality and in what they understood and believed. That Yeshua was a fully human prophet, that he was born of normal human parentage, and that they did not accept the teachings of Paul of Tarsus. However, at that time I was not aware of anyone else in the world who practiced such a faith in modern times, and so I reconciled myself to being alone in faith, the only human being on the entire planet who held these ancient views. I spent many long years of wandering like a refugee from one religious group to another, always the constant feeling of being an unwanted outsider, never quite fitting in with any group's required list of beliefs. However, with the advent of the internet, I eventually found that there were indeed others scattered lonesome around the world who held the same beliefs that I did. Today, I am proud to say that I serve that community, a community of both Jews and God-fearers who follow Torah, worship the God of Israel as one indivisible God, but who also value the ethical Jewish teachings of Yeshua of Nazareth, and who try to apply his focus of love, compassion, and humility in everyday life. Section 4. Recent update and footnote. In June 2012, I suffered a severe nervous breakdown as a result of sustained and unrelenting bullying at work. I was then diagnosed with a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Since then, both my mental and physical health have seriously deteriorated. Because I lost my job due to mental illness, for a long while I had very little income. For 2 years I managed on 1 meal a day. On one occasion I opened my cupboard and all I had was a small bottle of olive oil and some gluten-free flour. The story of Elijah and the widow came to mind. At that point I had to resort to a food bank for handouts of food. Those times truly taught me that Yahweh was my provider. However, in spite of all this, my suffering has brought me closer to God. How much I rely on God to feed and clothe me, to counsel and comfort me. It has brought me to a closer understanding of God's purpose and intent, not just in my own life, but for history and humanity. It has given me a greater comprehension of God's teachings and principles. If the reputation of Yahweh is enhanced and magnified, and the memory of my own life diminishes and is forgotten, then I will still have accomplished my purpose. If people can look at my low estate and say, "How can someone like him teach and say such things?" then the message that Yahweh gave to my heart and hearing has been delivered. Whatever is good, wise, and holy in my words, people will hopefully see that it comes not from me, but from God. I do not seek influence or power. I do not seek wealth or prestige for myself. I am a devoted servant of Yahweh. I do only God's will, and I labor only for Yahweh's great and holy purpose.